Well, good afternoon to everyone with us in the United States, joining us from Germany or elsewhere around the world. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And we are really pleased to be offering today's event along with our colleagues at the BMW Center at Georgetown University and the International Association for the Study of German Politics. I'm going to hand over to Eric Langenbacher, who is the director of our program on society, culture, and politics, and also a senior fellow here at AICGS, in just 1 minute. But before we do, I would just like to say how excited we are to be kicking off today a series that will look at issues related to German politics and the 2021 Bundestag election, which will happen on September 26th. Of course, we are one day ahead of the inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden here in Washington, and the partnership between Germany and the United States is going to be crucial, in some ways more crucial than it has been for a long time, as the Biden administration takes office, and as Germany, as the leading and most powerful country in the European Union, takes its approach to the Biden administration. So understanding the politics in Germany, how it affects Germany's foreign policy positions and engagement, not only with the United States, but more generally in an international context, is going to be extremely important. So with that, thank you all for joining us. And Eric Langenbacher, the microphone is yours.
Thanks, Jeff. I'll be very brief so that we can get into today's webinar. But as Jeff mentioned, this is it's our kickoff event for a year-long project that's devoted to the 2021 Bundestag election. Of course, every Bundestag election matters, but this one probably matters a little bit more than the last couple, given that there will be a new chancellor very late this year, or if it's like last time, it might be early in 2022, depending on how negotiations go. So there will be a transfer of power. There will be a new leader. And there will very likely be a new coalition in charge. So we want to explore how the various parties are preparing for the campaign. Today, we're going to look at the CDU, which I think is very timely given that they just chosen a new leader who might be the chancellor candidate for the union parties. Later on, we'll look at the SPD, the Greens, the AfD. We'll look at some of the demographics of the German electorate and as well as the campaign. And then after the election, we plan to have a very large conference, hopefully in person, but everything is obviously in the air. So as I mentioned, we're going to kick off today by looking at the Post-Merkel CSU and their preparations for the election now that they have, the CDU has a new leader. And I'm really happy to introduce briefly our two speakers. So first, we're going to have Matthias Dilling, who's a departmental lecturer in comparative politics and a special lecturer at Magdalen College at Oxford. He has a DPhil in politics and an MPhil in comparative government from Nuffield College at the University of Oxford and a BA from the Freie Universität in Berlin. So he works on comparative politics, but with a special emphasis on institutional development, party politics, inter-party politics, and party organization. And then, well, we'll hear from Isabelle Kürschner, Dr. Isabelle Kürschner, who is an expert on party politics and political systems, both in Germany and the United States. She has started her career in political consulting and works as an external advisor. For instance, between 2015 and 2017, she was a member of the Enquete Commission in the Bavarian State Parliament, looking at equal living conditions through Bavaria. She completed her undergraduate degree at the University in Erlangen, as well as McGill University in Montreal. And then she went on to get a master's and a doctorate from the Catholic University of Eichstätt. And I should also note that in addition to fellowships from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, she also is an AICGS fellow. So without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to Matthias.
This was the classic, sorry. Now I think I should be unmuted. Can you hear me? Yes, okay, wonderful, great. Thank you very much, Jeff and Eric, for having me. I want to start talking basically about one of the observations that I've made when kind of reading about the CDU or being asked to comment about the CDU recently. Every time I've been kind of, a lot of the articles that I've read recently, a lot of kind of the questions that I've received recently, basically felt like, inviting me to speak in ideology, kind of, basically kind of being very negative, the party being, a divided party, a party in crisis, etc. In the brief talk that I want to give to kick off our discussion, or to contribute to the discussion, I present 5 C's. I mean, obviously it has to be 5 C's because we're talking about the CDU. 5 C's that I think pick up on many of the points behind the negative outlooks for the basically for the CDU, why there might be such a negative kind of atmosphere expectations going into the election campaign, and argue that on each of these points, the CDU I think is actually in better shape than we often give it credit for. So the first C is competition with other parties, and actually that's probably kind of the most slightly counterintuitive one, right? Because like actually, if we look at the polls, and Isabelle and I were kind of chatting about this just before the course started, right? Because like this is the recent Politbarometer, the recent survey data on the CDU. We can actually clearly see in terms of kind of the surveys, it's very counterintuitive what the CDU would need to have to worry about, right? It's like it's been very consistently kind of around the 35%, like in the recent year. Surely to some extent, having kind of initially benefiting from a rally around the flag phenomenon behind kind of people kind of rallying behind the government when it came to the handling of the corona crisis. But as we've seen, this happened in many countries, but in Germany actually it stayed at fairly high approval levels. And also the CDU stayed at very high approval levels, while we've seen in other countries that actually support for many of the governing parties has declined. So I think this is a more, it's indicating that this seems to be a more kind of stable feature. And actually, importantly, we see that they're kind of very clearly ahead, almost not quite double, but almost double ahead in terms of the second largest party. It basically seems, that most likely the CDU has good chances to be part of the next government, and most likely also have very good chances to lead the next government, unless this is kind of the main threat that they seem to have been, that the CDU has discussed at its Congress this last week, unless there is indeed a red-red-green coalition between Greens, Social Democrats, and the Left Party. Whether this will be enough, and also whether this actually will be politically feasible, I do doubt it, but that seems to be kind of the main threat. But overall, it seems that at least for this year's election, the party should be, in a fairly good position. More in a long-term perspective, however, I think that actually could be a problem, and that might be interesting also to discuss in the Q&A, because given the weakness of the Social Democrats, it might actually be that in the mid-long run, the CDU might be doomed to govern, might be locked in government. And we know from other Christian democratic parties in Europe that this often doesn't turn out so well, and this only goes so far. So if we think about the Italian Christian Democrats, for example, that, basically where Italy's a dominant party, but eventually collapsed because, they basically competed with one another rather than with other parties. So, but in competition with other parties, more potentially kind of a problem for the CDU in the long run. Second C, competitive leadership elections. Like a lot of the discussions that we've recently seen focused around the fact that we had the second relatively tight leadership election between candidates supported by different intra-party factions. Laschet being put forward by the left-wing faction, supported by the CDA. Merz being supported by the MIT, which is kind of the more like market liberal faction in the CDU. And that's the second time that the results have been fairly close, that an election was truly competitive, and that election had actually to go to a runoff election between the two leading candidates after the first round. So that is true that this seems to be there seems to be a change within the CDU, and also within the way that the CDU takes decisions and compete and organizes its internal competition. But I would note that there's a significant difference in tone this year compared to the 2018 party congress when we had the last competitive election between Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer and Friedrich Merz, which is that like immediately after the election that took place last weekend, all candidates very quickly in their concession speech accepted the result and pledged their support to Laschet. And that is, so in terms of the tone that was set, it seemed to be much more kind of unifying than in 2018, which obviously shouldn't be surprising because this is an election year and parties have an incentive to basically agree given that there's an election coming up. I think the important point is that this is actually not so new for the CDU. You know, if you look into the party's history, it has a very interesting record of, you know, being quite divided and, you know, quite openly, kind of having different people going against each other, different positions being put forward, and still uniting when it actually comes to elections. We've seen this repeatedly in the past. Surely, so if you look at this figure, this shows, this gives us the vote share of the winning candidate in internal party presidency or party leadership elections. And surely it has become remarkably more competitive in recent years. But this doesn't mean that this didn't, like, you know, the previously the party didn't see competitive elections. Indeed, it did see these elections, intense conflicts in the past. It was the Erhard election at the end of the Adenauer era, so the era of Germany's first chancellor, the first leadership transition. This kind of spike down was the election at the end, like in 1971, when Rainer Barzel was won against Helmut Kohl. Again, a very divided time. We had the kind of a very weak result for Helmut Kohl, like in a party congress where there would have almost been a coup against the sitting party leader. So truly, the CDU has always been a very internally diverse party, and a party that, you know, could very cordially fight with one another, also very open, like kind of visibly in a very open way. Moreover, I would say, just looking at the fact that this last election was very close, I would say it's actually a poor indicator and doesn't really kind of give a lot of credit to how the party actually works. The party, even like when you see kind of 100% here during the Adenauer era, and you see these very high approval ratings or kind of high election results, this doesn't translate into a high level, or this doesn't mean that there are high levels of party unity. It simply means the party agreed internally for horse trading before who would win, and often these kind of agreements like actually followed months of very intense internal conflict. So what you might see is rather a change toward more transparency in how the party internally organizes this competition, but it's surely not, in my opinion, a change toward more divisions within the party. Third C. Campaigning. There's been like repeated concerns about basically the CDU not having any program apart from their support for Angela Merkel. I would say that there's certain truth to that in the sense that the party heavily relied on the popularity of Angela Merkel in some elections, in 2013 most prominently. 2017, the last election, was already kind of completely different story. But more importantly, I think the party has actually kind of realized this, it seems. Like they're watching the contributions at the party congress last weekend. There are actually kind of three clear themes that seem to emerge, that the party seem to have identified as kind of, you know, the themes that they want to occupy and that they want to work at. First is weekend digital. We care about climate change and the economy. And we are younger and more female than you think. How convincing is this? Usually we would not associate the CDU with kind of, you know, digital, you know, progress and being the most techie party in Germany. However, for those who have followed the party congress over the weekend, I didn't expect such a smooth and actually pretty well done running in terms of the way that they organized the congress, the way kind of really professional, you know, kind of videos, the way that kind of cameras were used, kind of nice graphics, almost reminding me of the BBC in the UK, basically, in presenting kind of election results. So that was quite impressive, actually. The message about climate change, sure, that is a change in compared to the party's orientation earlier, but this change has already happened, started happening in 2011. And the idea to basically, you know, it is actually attachable or kind of reconcilable with typical Christian democratic positions, as the CDU often emphasizes, protecting the environment is a Christian responsibility out of protecting God's creation. So that, you know, ideologically that can be combined. Younger and more female, you might wonder, because clearly there have been a lot of discussions to what extent the CDU is just going back to the old days, you know, three old white men running for the leadership. I would say, to the CDU's credit, if we look at the lower level, basically at the leadership board, we've seen a fairly steady increase in the number of women on that, in the share of women at that board. It's still the minority. It's still not equality, but there has been like significant change. However, I think the CDU also needs to realize that there seems to be a gap between kind of a lot of these kind of often young, often female politicians that basically have now been elected into the party leadership board on Saturday, and actually really positions of influence, because only 3 out of 17 leaders of the very important state branches of the CDU in the different German länder, different German states, are actually female. So I think that this is a valid point of valid criticism. Just to, because I know that I don't have so much time, on the next Chancellor candidate, is it, there's a lot of discussion there about the unpopularity, actually, the lack of approval, the poor approval ratings for all 3 candidates that were run for office for the CDU leadership on Saturday. And indeed, actually, one of the candidates won that was really that was not even the most popular if we look at the general polls, because this would have been Friedrich Merz. However, there is also obviously the option to, which has been discussed, to agree on Markus Söder, leader of the CSU, running in this year's election. And while one could say that, is this a sign of weakness against the CDU? The only thing that I can say is that this is not the first time that this happened, right? I mean, CSU candidates who vary in Christian Democrats have already run in twice in 1980 and 2002. Still, the question, is it unusually late, and does this reveal to agree on a chancellor candidate? And does this reveal actually a high level of division? Well, it's not so late, actually. If we think about 22, in 2002, the CDU basically just announced mid-January who would be their chancellor candidate for the election in the fall. So the CDU is slightly behind schedule, but not too behind schedule. I think the core challenges, to conclude, that the CDU basically faces at the moment, and I think are really the challenges for the party to strike, is basically that they're trying to strike 3 difficult balances. First, they need to try to mobilize their core base while appealing to swing voters, especially young urban and female voters. And the message, we are weak and digital, we care about the environment, and we are more female and younger than you think, might work toward appealing to swing voters. It's a question to what extent that actually mobilizes more middle class base. Another challenge, and Eric mentioned this in the beginning, is obviously the balance, between we might have a different, or we will most likely have a different coalition. The challenge will be here to treat the Greens as political rivals, but also pretend not to push this too much, because they might actually end up in a coalition with them afterwards. And finally, it's interesting challenge that they've been trying to strike on Saturday was basically presenting the party as a party of change, modern party, progressive party, but on the other hand, it's also a conservative party. It's a difficult challenge to strike. What I think we can see how the CDU might be trying to do that moving forward is basically by taking what Laschet called the continuity of success as basically to try to strike this balance between change and conservative party. But also, I think what seems to be the clear message for the party going into this campaign is we must not, as Elmar Brok called it on Saturday, we must not leave the political center to the Greens. And I stop here, and thank you for having me and for listening.
Thank you, Matthias. That was excellent. Isabelle, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Matthias, for already giving this great overview and handing me the ball to talk about the CSU, the smaller sister, if you like, of the CDU in Germany. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Jeff, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be on a webinar with you today. Of course, I'd rather be in DC, but maybe these days it's easier and safer to be office. Even though my youngest just showed up twice, that's when I turned off the video and said, could you please hold on to the child, I'm talking. So I hope there will be no further disruption as I start talking about the Christian Social Union, the CSU. I am from the state of Bavaria, so And I studied, or I spent a lot of time at studying political science in the state of Bavaria. And of course, always the CSU plays a big role here. Actually, the final question in my oral master's exam from my professor was, what is the success factor, the biggest success factor of the CSU? And I was like, what is he talking about? And actually the answer was, the CSU is Bavaria, or Bavaria is the CSU. I'm not sure that the other parties would agree with that in the state of Bavaria, because of course there are others as well, but it certainly holds a very, a different and a very specific role here in this state, and also in Germany. When we look at the CDU and the CSU as a whole on the federal level, of course, the CDU is the bigger sister, the much bigger party. The CDU, I was looking this up today, has, as of now, 405,816 party members, so over 400,000. The CSU has 139,130 party members. So the CDU clearly is the bigger party. They are currently holding 200 of the 709 Bundestag seats. The CDU is holding 200 seats, while the CSU is holding 46 seats in the Bundestag. So also this is much smaller. The CDU in 2017 received 12.5 million of the popular vote, of the Zweitstimme, and the CSU received 2.9 million of the popular vote in Germany. But we need to keep in mind that, of course, the CSU is only running in one of the 16 states in the state of Bavaria, and therefore it is still quite impressive to come up with 6.2% of the total popular vote in Germany as a party that is only running in one state. And that also means that the CSU is usually having the highest results of a single party in Germany. On the state level, they were having the absolute majority for decades. Holding the absolute majority, did not have to go into coalitions on the state level, which is very unusual in Germany. They even had a 2/3 majority in the early 2000, in the late 90s under Edmund Stoiber. So it really is, or has been, a very successful party, and it is always absolutely necessary for the whole electoral results of the CDU, CSU on the federal level, that the CSU is doing fairly well in Bavaria. So yes, it's smaller, but that doesn't mean that it's not just as important as the CDU. What the CSU is often seen as is the conservative stronghold, or also the conservative consciousness of the union, the CDU, CSU parties, and that is also seen in Berlin many times, and even or especially when we look at the last 15.5 years under Angela Merkel. There were many discussions where the CSU were really paying a lot of attention to the more, especially social conservative topics, like some of you might remember the famous Herdprämie. There was a parental bonus that was to be paid for parents who were taking care of their children at home, and the CSU made sure that the division between the fathers and the mothers would not be too equally divided, so that there would still be a 12-month period that the mother could stay at home, and an additional 2-month period for the father. That could also be reversed. But the CSU was always making sure that the gender roles and all this conservative, what the conservative base really cares about, was paid attention to in the coalitions. Also, the famous income splitting, the Ehegattensplitting, is something that the CSU is still really holding on to. That means if spouses. If one spouse is working and the other one is either working for very low income part-time work or staying at home, they can split their overall income equally and then have to pay fewer taxes, which also means that it supports the old family structure. Of course, as we all remember, during the refugee crisis in 2015, 2016, Seehofer was probably Angela Merkel's biggest enemy within her own coalition, within her own even party group, because CDU, CSU, CDU, CSU have a joint party group in the Bundestag that was not agreeing with a lot of things that she did. And he was always the one who was asking for the Obergrenze, a cap of 200,000 refugees per year for Germany. And that was also something that the CSU always got a lot of attention from on the federal stage, and making sure not to remain the small local Bavarian state party. But the question is, what role will the CSU play in the future and in future possible coalitions? And is the CSU happy about the election of Armin Laschet, or would they rather have had somebody else? With the decision of the CDU delegates to vote for Armin Laschet, they decided that their party should remain in the center. Somebody said on television on Saturday, if I hear the word Mitte one more time, I'm going to scream, because it was all about center, 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 keeping the party in the center, and or shifting it to the right, which would have been the case with Friedrich Merz. So the party is going to stay in what is called the inclusive center that Angela Merkel has already moved it to. And Armin Laschet, even though he might not continue doing exactly what Merkel was doing, he stands for the same kind of center politics that she has been doing for the last 16 years. And what is quite interesting is that the CDU delegates voted twice for this more moderate center candidates. 2 years ago for Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, because Armin Laschet is not the direct successor of Angela Merkel. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, of course, was the party leader for the last 2 years. And she also was, was the candidate that Angela Merkel had brought into onto the stage. And she was also one of these people that were claiming the center, or having the party remain in the center, and also open for different coalitions on the federal level. So is the CSU happy about that? Well, they might be pretty happy, because with the CDU and Armin Laschet staying more towards, or remaining towards the center, they are still leaving that gap open for those who are still longing for more conservatism, and who would like to have something a little not really right of the CDU, but still remain a little more conservative, and that what or the fields that Friedrich Merz would have covered more than Armin Laschet will do. So yes, the CSU might be quite happy with the results. We will never know, because of course they will always say that this is the CDU's decision and not theirs. And of course, they are congratulating. It's not like the Mittelstandsunion, who clearly showed their disappointment on Saturday. I think it was quite obvious that they were not happy. And they also, their leader also said so, that it's like after a soccer game, you are disappointed, you might need a few days, but then you have to move on. The CSU, of course, did not show such emotions, and said that they will move on working together strongly and fighting to win the next elections. The big question, of course, will be who is the next candidate for Chancellor for the CDU-CSU. because it's given that always the CDU leader, even though it happened most times in the past, will be the next candidate for chancellor. As Matthias had already said, in 1980 and in 2002, the CSU candidate, Franz Josef Strauß and Edmund Stoiber, were running for chancellor unsuccessfully. So we never had a Bavarian CSU chancellor in Germany. But still, the option or the possibility is there. And I really didn't know who I felt more sorry for on the weekend, for the journalists who were repeatedly trying to get the answer out of Markus Söder from every single angle you could imagine. And I think Anne Will did pretty well in her show on Sunday night, because she tried the more personal angle, like, yeah, you might not go public with that, but just to be honest, you must have made up your mind. And I was like, oh, what's he going to say to this now? But of course, he had his very diplomatic answer that he had probably given 100 times. That's why I'm saying I don't know who I felt more sorry for, the one who was asked the question again and again and again, and he will not give this answer, or the journalists who were asking the question. So that will remain, quite interesting until at least Easter. They want to wait for the next two federal elections in Baden-Württemberg and Rhineland-Palatinate for to see how the CDU does and how Armin Laschet can get the voters together and have them and mobilize them. And then the decision who is the next candidate for chancellor. Of course, the pollings right now, the approval ratings are really, really high for Markus Söder. He is praised. He used to be the less liked prime minister of all the 16 states, I think about 2 years ago. But since his handling of the COVID pandemic, his approval ratings are really high. And a lot of people in Germany could actually see him as the next chancellor. So that will also remain very interesting. And also quite interesting, both Laschet and Markus Söder have been what I thought really quite not only polite, but really kind of already reaching out towards the Green Party in particular. Also some to the Laschet, even more to the FDP than Söder more towards the Green Party. And also, like Matthias already said, for the CDU, the CSU likes to see itself as a conservative party, but always, like you might remember, laptop and lederhose, like really being progressive when it comes to digitalization and now also climate, energy, and women. Well, Markus Söder more than the rest of his party, but we'll see how far this will get them. So it remains really interesting. And the question will not only be, will Söder be asked, but also what will his answer be? Because everybody who knows him says he's only running when he has a really good chance to win. He doesn't want to lose, and then he rather stays in Bavaria. So we'll see. It's going to remain very interesting.
All right, thank you so much. So we're now going to pivot to our question and answer period. So the way that we've been doing this is I will read out the questions to our panelists. So if you could please type your question into the Q&A box at the very bottom of the Zoom screen, that would be excellent. And we already have quite a few questions in here. So one thing that didn't come up yet is the alternative for Germany, the AfD, and how that affects the calculations of the parties and the various leaders. So I'm going to also try to combine questions. From Dan Huff, how is the CDU-CSU going to balance the need to speak to centrist voters who could plausibly vote Green or maybe FDP if they still exist, while at the same time ensuring that the AfD doesn't outflank them to the right? And then I'll combine that with a question from Christian Schmidt about rumors that the Verfassungsschutz will declare the AfD as a radical or extreme party next week, and how that might affect the different kind of, I guess, tactics that the union parties used towards the AFD. So, Matthias, would you maybe like to go first?
I think this is a great question. In terms of, in terms of balancing, and I think this will be kind of the core, kind of one of the core challenges. So I would rather see it in terms of kind of balancing, kind of appealing to kind of swing voters, urban, female, young, so potentially kind of voters who might defect or might kind of choose the Greens over the CDU, between that on the one hand and mobilizing their own base on the other hand. Looking at the current standings of both the FDP and the AFD in the polls, I do not think that this seems to reflect, the AFD has been pretty stable. You're kind of hovering around, within the margin of errors, like around this level, around, kind of between 10, 12, 15%. But that is basically kind of, the level. And that has been fairly stable. So those who, and similarly stable at a lower level for the FDP. So they're trying to appeal to these voters, would basically be trying to kind of appeal to more AFD and FDP core voters or like identifiers. And I think that this is not a strategy. I think given the way that both the AFD and the FDP have been developing in this parliamentary period, there's less an issue, less a problem, I think, for the CDU to lose potential voters to these parties because they have been presenting themselves as very right-wing. So that is not doesn't square with this kind of more centrist Christian democratic, especially Catholic understanding that is still prominent for the CDU. How they will manage to kind of try to get out their base to vote, so it might also be a battle for turnout, and trying to kind of avoid that they lose even more younger voters to the Greens. That is indeed an interesting balance. And I think we've already seen in Laschet's comments, I think we've already seen some potential answer to that. This message of the continuity of success, not weiter so, as simply going on as usual, picking up that there is a sense for change, there's a desire for change, but basically kind of, saying, but look at us, we've also been doing pretty well. So let's just continue what has been doing well and, kind of hop on to these changes, digitalization, new forms of communication and so on that have gained, climate change that have gained.
Isabelle, maybe from the Bavarian perspective, I remember that Söder tried to tack right during the last Landtagswahl in Bavaria with, I would say, only mixed success. And the AfD is excellent at trolling the CSU. I'll never forget the campaign posters stating, we're going to do what the CSU says. Right. So what are the Bavarians saying about tactics towards the?
Yeah, I think just as you said, the CSU realized the mistake that they made during the last federal elections. The results were not that well. It was a difficult time as well. But so I think this might not be as much of a problem going forward as really getting the votes from the possible Green Party voters. I think this is a much bigger danger now for the CSU. I don't think that they will be fischen am rechten Rand. They won't really go for the right-wing votes. I think this is something they probably will write off and say, okay, we need to move into different directions. And I think Markus Söder is probably smart enough to not make this mistake again. What I think it will come down to is really personalities and the candidates who are running. And there, the CDU, CSU, they have an advantage towards the Green, both Armin Laschet and Markus Söder, because they are both prime ministers at their states. They are running a government. They are showing how it works. They can also show what they can do when it comes to climate change or also the agriculture. While the Greens are still, they are governing in some states, but there's only one Green prime minister in Baden-Württemberg. And the question will really be, how can they show that they are actually doing what they're saying, not as the AfD asked on their on on their campaigns, but I think this will be their advantage to say, actually, we are leading a successful governments. We have already proven how we are doing this. We know the challenges that are lying ahead, and this is and we will actually really get our hands onto this and start working on this. While the Greens are still, I mean, we are seeing that the Greens are also pretty divided between the very ideologically basis and the more realistic part of the party. And this is also, it's going to be hard for them when they're running for federal elections, where they have to move away a little bit from their ideologic cores on how they can hold on to this to their voters. So I think personality, or the people who are actually running in the end, will be a pretty deciding force on that.
All right, I'm going to jump down and take a question now from Sarah Williardi, which is, how do you see the role of women in the post-Merkel CDU? If the party would like to present itself as younger and more female than you might think, do you see validity to that claim?
This is from, so should I answer that, Eric, I suppose? Yes, okay. I think you're right. And Sarah, thanks for this question. I think, I mean, as I said, I think there are two things going on. There's the kind of like some generational change in kind of the content, like as you've shown in your work. There is kind of, you know, the CDU has realized that they have a huge kind of gender imbalance problem. They already realized this in the 80s. There were massive discussions in the 90s. It took ages to kind of, you know, implement and actually kind of use the kind of the quorum that of female representation that they actually used. It's, you know, very for Saturday they were very kind of keen or very clear on like emphasizing that like for each election basically kind of the quorum was kind of met immediately. I think it's interesting that like we do have people like Laura Hopman, we do have people like Anna Kreie, so right, so kind of young JUs from the youth movement supported candidates who are young and female, and they've been elected. They were elected to the Bundesvorstand, to the leadership board. So I think that, and this continues this like the slope that I've shown in the one graph, that we do have an increase, a gradual increase. But I am completely with any critic here who basically says, yes, but isn't there a gap between that level and the leadership level? And I think that is very true. And it might take the party a bit longer to actually kind of catch up on this. The overall trend, however, at least in leadership positions, is descriptively, at least, like it seems to be fairly positive.
Isabelle, would you like to weigh in?
Just briefly, I mean, in preparation for this, I was watching the debate from last year's or 2019 CSU party convention on the gender quota, and it was really from far beyond yesterday. I mean, there are still voices that if you heard these as a young woman, you would definitely not vote for this party. But then again, the party leadership was not happy with that. They were really working on a paper to bring in more female, especially younger female candidates, and also be more attractive to the female voters. So with Angela Merkel and now also Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer gone, it will be much harder. I think there were women voting for the CDU because of Angela Merkel as well. Markus Söder, for example, has positioned himself in favor of the gender quotas for the economy. And that certainly is, at least among a certain group of women, something that is seen as more progressive. It's going to be hard, and it's for a long time, not always. In the past, the CDU, CSU had more female voters than male, but that's a long time ago. For the last decade at least, it's been the opposite. So this is definitely going to be a very, very hard group to reach for both parties.
So speaking about hard groups to reach, there's a question here about Eastern Germany. And of course, there have been media reports that many Eastern CDU-lers are not happy with Laschet and would have vastly have preferred Merz. So what do you think the CDU can do to reach out to voters specifically in Eastern Germany?
I found it interesting that among the three candidates, there was only one on Saturday who explicitly mentioned Eastern Germany and Eastern Germans, and that was Norbert Röttgen, who explicitly mentioned in his speech, appealed to local to people active at the local political level, so Kommunalpolitiker, but also explicitly to Eastern Germans. I think Laschet should remember that moving forward, that his base, I mean, he won the election based on his very clear embedment in the largest state branch that that the CDU has, also with the support by the CDA, and so his power base is pretty much Western German. So I think and the CDU has been neglecting its Eastern German state branches for quite some time now, and there is this level of frustration that you mentioned within the party. So I think the CDU has traditionally been very good in informally incorporating different groups in the allocation of offices, in the formulation of policy positions, and I think they would need to reach out more to their party branches there. But I think it's primarily again making sure that they keep what they've got. In Eastern Germany, it's demographically different. It's in terms of socioeconomic structure, but also in terms of the role of religion, in how much higher secularization levels in Eastern Germany compared to the West. So there's always been a tricky challenge for the CDU in Eastern Germany, but I do agree that they have been taking some states a bit for granted, like Saxony, like Thuringia. And clearly they need to that is an issue and a challenge for the party.
All right, maybe moving on to a question from Tom Lancaster, which I think is really fascinating. Given the top-down style of leadership in both parties, especially regarding leadership choices, do you think there will be potential conflicts for the CDU-CSU in terms of a future coalition with the much more bottom-up Greens? Isabelle, would you like to take first crack?
What I've been thinking of is I've been to both political Aschermittwochs, the CSU Aschermittwoch in Passau and the Green Aschermittwoch in Passau, two completely different worlds. So the style is completely different. I would not so much agree on the difference in the top-down leadership style. I mean, in parties, it's always democratic elections. It's always about majorities, about finding these majorities and agreeing on and making compromises and so on. So, but I think overall the basis is still very, very different. The CSU basis, the CDU basis is in so many ways different. When you look at the youth organizations, the Junge Union is even more conservative than the rest of the party in both cases, CSU and CDU. The Young Greens, wow, they are coming up with quite some interesting ideas. And so this is going to be, yeah, as I said, interesting. I mean, the question is, how much do they actually have to come together, the basis? It's not going to govern. So, but this is definitely going to remain a very interesting thing to see folding out in the near future. On the other hand, there are also people in both parties that are not that far apart. I mean, there are swing voters between the CDU, CSU and the Green Party, and they are not this hardcore basis that you might have in mind when you think about these parties.
All right, well, let's move on. So maybe a couple of policy questions and then something to do with the transatlantic relationship. So from Ed Turner, what do you think the CDU-CSU's fiscal policy platform will look like going forward? Will there be swifter deficit reduction for Germany and Europe, a different emphasis to the SPD, or do you think that they'll come up with something more centrist?
I think it depends on, I mean, let's assume that they're probably entering a coalition, or if they form a coalition, they probably will form it with the Greens. I hardly see any kind of politically kind of realistic alternative at the moment. I mean, as I said, like, and the realistic options are black Greens, so CDU, CSU, and Greens, or red green. I think other options are unlikely. If this is true and they basically kind of form a coalition with the Greens, I expect a more centrist fiscal policy. I do expect that the CDU might actually be in a position to get a bit more from the negotiations than in the past, because for the obviously kind of, Isabelle already mentioned the internal divisions within the Green Party. This will really come out after the election, I expect. I mean, it's easy, it's like, it's one thing to appeal to different sides during an election campaign and make it as, almost like a catch-all-ish kind of party appeal. And then another thing to basically enter coalition talks. So this will be very challenging for the Greens. It also actually will be challenging for the CDU because it might actually give them more agency than they had in previous coalition negotiations, which obviously kind of, also challenges them to make up their mind. Laschet is, I think, a genuinely convincing centrist person in this regard, right? It's like, I mean, he comes with the backup of the left-wing faction, with the background in the CDR, but is also leading the only remaining kind of basically land or state coalition with the FDP. So in this regard, I can't see him like to either kind of massively swift to the left or the right. But it will be interesting to see how the Greens will respond afterwards.
Isabelle, any thoughts?
No, I think Matthias has pretty much said it all. Mm-hmm.
All right, so about the transatlantic relationship. So it will likely be either Laschet or Söder as the next chancellor. How do you envision either of them or both of them working with the Biden-Harris administration in the United States, presuming that everything goes as planned tomorrow?
That is a very interesting question, and that I think the answer would have been much easier if you had asked about Röttgen, but it's not him, obviously. I mean, they are definitely both leaning towards the West, towards the United States, everyone. And I think this has not even to do with Laschet or Söder. I think this is pretty much everyone who is a possible new chancellor for Germany is happy to work with a serious, a president you can take serious and is more reliable and is, going back to more normal politics than Trump was. So I think this is probably not so much. I don't see it playing a big role in the campaign. I really think the campaign will be really centered on, of course, internal politics. COVID will still play a role in the fall. It will still be, and especially the recovery from COVID. And there already the topics are out there that we need to like kickstart the economy with a greener economy, more digitalization. Of course, Europe will play a big role. I don't think that transatlantic relations will play that big a role, but I can see both of them working quite well with the new Biden-Harris administration. I don't foresee any problems there.
Yeah, if I can just like add on that, like for this, I mean, the CDU has always been the party of transatlantic kind of cooperation negotiations. This is one of the kind of core identity pillars of that party. And we've seen this like probably even more than the CSU. If we think about kind of the conflict between Adenauer and Strauss in the 60s over kind of foreign policy directions, Atlanticist versus Gaullist, kind of orientation toward North America, toward Western Europe discussion. But this for the CDU, kind of the emphasis on America and the United States as being an essential ally of Western Germany. This is, I agree with Isabelle that this will not be an issue because it has never been an issue of debate in the party, at least on the CDU. It's like, I mean, not well. And so I expect, I agree that it will continue.
All right, we're almost out of time. So of course I have to put you on the spot and pose the question, who do you think will be the chancellor candidate? I know what I think. I think it's going to be Söder. I think that we're almost all assuming it's going to be Soto, whether he wants to admit it or not. And I think that's actually brilliant for the union parties because they get the more centrist CDU leader, and then they have a Bavarian that can tack right perhaps a little bit more easily and deal with that balance that Matthias and Isabelle, you were talking about. But what do you think? And then also, if Söder were to leave Bavaria, who would take over as minister president? And then also, you know, just for fun, are you hearing any rumors about what's next for Angela Merkel?
Actually, that would be the first time that I say I think Söder is going to be the candidate. I simply don't know. I mean, he's always said his place is in Bavaria, whatever that means. As I said before, he doesn't want to lose. So it needs to be a pretty safe bet for him to run. Maybe he'll find a way to work together with Laschet and support him. And Laschet is, when you see him, he is a winning person. Like even the people who didn't agree with him might support him more strongly, and he might even be the candidate. No, I don't think Söder is going to be the candidate and the next chancellor. If he left Bavaria, however, I think Hermann would probably be the closest to be his successor, but the question will probably not be asked as of now.
That's a good question. I always say, you know, if I manage to make predictions, I would be on the. I have a crystal ball and be on the beach with somewhere nice and warm and not in rainy UK. But I am. If you had asked me this question a year ago, I would have said Laschet. I mean, I kept saying that Laschet will be the next leader. You know, I've been saying this for years, and I said, you know, it will be Laschet. And Laschet will also insist on being the chancellor. Given the increasing criticism, or the chancellor candidate, sorry, given the increasing criticism over his handling of the corona situation in North Rhine-Westphalia, I think he's in a much weaker position. So I probably would say that I can see that it could be Söder. If it is Söder, what I will be interested in seeing, or what I would be following closely in the campaign, is whether Söder's political flexibility in the past actually comes up being a problem. Because, you know, his kind of being the progressive green, that is a fairly recent phenomenon. Like just like 2 years, I think 2 years or 3 years ago, he was meeting with like Kurz and Babic, and like so with kind of more right-leaning and right-wing politicians in Europe. So whether this will haunt him during the campaign, or whether this will be a problem, will be interesting to watch.
All right, well, we've come up to 1 o'clock, so we will unfortunately have to conclude this conversation. I want to thank our two speakers for very, very insightful comments. I also want to thank the International Association for the Study of German Politics, and particularly Ed Turner for collaborating with us on this project. I'd also like to thank the BMW Center for German and European Studies at Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C., and particularly Katrin Zieg, the director, for also collaborating with us. And of course, big thanks to all of my colleagues at AICGS for supporting this. But I'd like to give a special thanks to Liz Carruth for just everything that she does. So please do look at our advisor, sign up for the advisor if you haven't already, and you will there see announcements for our upcoming events. The next ones will likely be on the SPD and Greens, but not necessarily in that order. So we shall see. So thank you, everybody. And for those of you in Washington, D.C., I hope that you stay as safe as you can tomorrow and in the days to come. Goodbye.